I have a large butcher block countertop that I need to make for some people. There are some future neighbors and they're just about done with their house and they're ready for this, so I've got to get on it. At this point, I've already milled a bunch of this stuff, so I didn't take you through all those steps. I show it in a bunch of my other projects, but I like to start at the joiner. A friend of mine had a really large joiner, so I used his to get one flat face on all of these boards, as well as one edge that is 90 degrees to that. So now I'm going to run them through my planer to get the other side co-planer, and then I'm going to start ripping strips at the table saw. They want this butcher block to end up at 2 inches thick, so I'm going to cut 2-inch pieces and then turn them 90 degrees and just start assembling this thing. It needs to be 6 feet long and counter depth, so it's going to be a big heavy piece, but I think they'll have it in their house for years, and I was going to show you how I do it. At this point, I've got everything planed down so that both of these faces are parallel now, and now I'm ready to take it to the table saw and rip my strips. I'm going to rip 2-inch strips, just slightly over 2 inches, because that's what the finished thickness I want to end up at, and it's going to be 26 inches deep. Now I am just going to take all of the boards and run them quickly across the drum sander a couple of times. What that's going to do is clean up any of these saw marks from the table saw and should help to get a nicer glue line as I glue all these together. I don't think it'll take that long. I've got it set up, and I'm just going to, since I cut them all at the same thickness, I'm just going to do all one pass, then move it a little bit, do all one pass, so on and so forth. I ripped a spare piece of plywood down to just wider than what I need this countertop to be. What I'm going to do is take some sheathing tape and just line it here so that the glue won't stick all to it, and that will give me a nice surface to kind of glue and clamp everything down to. Not all of these boards are long enough to go the full width, so I'm going to have to do some splices. That way I can clamp down to the board as well as to each other. I took a little bit of time and laid all the boards out the way I wanted them to look in the final piece. I was very careful with the miter saw to cut the ends as square as possible so that they would meet up correctly. I believe I am ready for gluing all of this up. I'm going to spend a little bit more time making sure I have the face that I want showing up so that I make sure this is the top, and then the bottom doesn't really matter because it's going to be underneath the countertop. This side, I was one little half piece short, so I ended up using a piece I had left over. It's a little bit wide here, but this is slightly wider than we need it to be anyway. So I'll plan on this being the back, and we will cut it off in place when it gets to the client's house, just to make sure it's exactly what it needs to be. But yeah, I'm going to get to gluing this up. I'm just going to turn on a time lapse because I think it's going to be really messy and a lot of glue everywhere, but I'm excited to get it all together. I ended up gluing this up in multiple sections. I couldn't figure out a better way to get it all glued up at once. The glue was kind of starting to set on me as I would do 4 or 5 boards, so I would just do a row and clamp it for a little while, come back after the glue was set enough, and keep adding on to that. For some of the excess boards you see hanging off the end, I started out trying to trim those off just to get them a little more manageable with my jigsaw, but I didn't have a blade long enough, so I was having to come back and use a finish saw or a pull saw anyway, and then I decided it was just faster to use the pull saw to start with. If there's one hint I can give you through this whole project, it's don't drop the entire countertop, including clamps, on your thigh while you're trying to flip it over. It hurts a little bit. I have scraped all the glue off now, and it's time to take this to get it flattened. Luckily, I have a friend who has a 36-inch wide belt sander, so this will fit through it. We'll run a few passes, probably on 80 grit if he has that, just because it's not perfect. It needs a little bit of flattening, but that should get it down to where I can do the rest of it with my random orbit sander, and I just have some hours of sanding ahead of me. So let's get going. This took quite a few passes, even with this really rough 60 grit paper on it, but I'm really pleased with how it came out after running it through the machine. I just trimmed up the backside edge so that it would be even for now as I'm handling it. This was just where I had that uneven board scrap that I used to kind of make sure that I had enough width for the countertop. I am back at my shop. That was quite the workout, and usually my friend is there to help me, but he had to run somewhere, so I muscled this thing through the sander, but it did a pretty good job. Now I've got to work my way up through the grits using my Surf Prep random orbit sander. I put a pretty aggressive paper on there on his sander. I think it was 60 grit, so it's pretty rough. But that type of sanding leaves sanding marks anyway. It leaves streaks in it, so you always want to come back with a random orbit sander. I'm just going to start at 80 and spend plenty of time doing that, getting rid of those 60 grit scratches. And I'm going to do a little bit of sanding on the bottom, but I'm not going to take it up nearly as high as the top. I built this thing a little bit bigger than the client needed because I knew we would want to cut it down to a more exact size once he got the cabinets in and got it built. I got the final dimensions from him, so here I'm just using my track saw to cut it to the final dimension. And with this thick of a piece of hardwood, I like to do it in 2 passes. I usually try to go about halfway through, then I lower the blade all the way and make the final cut. This typically gives me a pretty clean cut, and I'm happy with it. The client wanted a simple roundover on the edge, so I'm just using a 1/8 inch roundover bit, and then I'll finesse it by hand with some sanding. There were a couple spots that I was not totally pleased with how the boards went together. I don't know if they weren't perfectly square or I didn't get them clamped right, but they were so small that I could use some CA glue to fill in those gaps. My go-to for walnut is this medium black CA glue from Starbond. I'm an affiliate of Starbond, so if you want to pick up some of this or anything else that you see me use in this video, I'll have links below. I'm not sure why I didn't start the camera when I did this epoxy fill, but there was one knot that I ended up having in here that was a little too large for filling with CA glue. So I mixed up some 5-minute epoxy, put some black pigment in there, and filled it really quick. Once I sanded it back, it looked really nice. After filling these small voids, it was time to do the sanding with 120 grit. So I did the whole thing really thoroughly, and then it was time to raise the grain. The reason for raising the grain is to actually make the fibers of the wood stand back up after you have sanded it. So I sanded it to 120 and then did this treatment with the water. What that will do is allow me to sand it back with 220, and it will knock down all of that fuzziness or that grain that stood up when it got wet. That way, it won't do this when the client washes their countertop with soap and water like they're going to. One of my favorite finishes for cutting boards that I've used for years is this Mahone's Finishes. They call it a utility finish. It is basically a walnut oil, but it's not the cooking walnut oil. They distill it or do something to remove the protein to people that have nut allergies. It pulls that out, and it also prevents it from going rancid. So you don't want to use an oil that goes down in your board and goes rancid, like olive oil or cooking oils like that, like vegetable oil. That could get down in the fibers of the wood and then go rancid and start to smell and have bacteria. So I like using something like this. I found out about it from bowl turners. A lot of bowl turners use this stuff, and I order it by the gallon and just refill different things. So I've got a little container for my clients. I'm going to put some in there so that as this wears and dries out as they're cleaning it, they can just apply more of this oil as they need to. And I think that'll be nice for them to have. It's feeling great. I've sanded it all the way up to 220, and boy, it's smooth and sure feels nice. So I'm gonna get going oiling this so it can dry a little bit, and then I need to take it over to their house. I put some of the oil on the underside of the counter. This may not totally be necessary, but I don't want this thing absorbing more moisture from an uncured underside than the top side. So I went ahead and oiled the bottom off camera. And here I'm going to apply the oil with this silicone scraper and just let it soak in basically as much as it wants. With this finish, I've found I like to come back after a few hours and use a cloth to just get rid of any excess that may be sitting and pooling on the surface. And then I like to let it dry overnight. This stuff actually soaks into the wood and dries pretty well so that you're not going to have this oily thing that you're holding and touching. Some other oils, like mineral oil, they never truly dry, and they will always feel a little bit oily as you do this. This client really did not want any of the lighter sapwood in there, so I did all I could to keep most of that out, and most of this is heartwood, but it looks like a totally different countertop once you put finish on it. They are frantically trying to get their house finished, so I brought it over and they weren't quite ready to set the countertop in place yet, so I wanted to put it up there just to see kind of what it would look like, but obviously this is not set in the final place. To get this thing to fit, they're going to have to kind of carve out a little bit of the drywall there. And then this thing should just drop right in there and look excellent. I wanted to say thanks to my clients for trusting me to build this for them. Thanks to them for letting me film this, even though their house is not done. I know they're trying to get in there. And thank you for watching.